Good morning. Well, as Ann said, welcome to the opening conversation at Double Exposure. I want to say a few words, and then I'll introduce the panelists, and then let them each have about 5 minutes. I think it would be good because you have to show things. And then we'll get into a conversation, and then after that, we will take questions from the audience. Does that work with everybody? Yeah? Okay, you get a vote. It's democracy, right? Yeah. So a couple of things I want to say before we get into, before I introduce the fellow panelists here. I know there's been a lot of conversation around the issue of race and inclusion, largely spurred by the election of the current president. And as a colleague of mine, a friend of mine, Nicole Hannah-Jones with the 1619 project. It's a wonderful project. If you haven't read it, I suggest you do. But these are not new issues, right? These are long-standing issues that have been going on forever. And it's just now that I think some segments have started to pay attention, but the issue of having people of color in decision-making positions, not just participating, but in decision-making positions, and being able to produce the content is something that people have struggled with. We've struggled with for years. So these are not new issues. And then I also want to say when we do like a lot of panels around conversations around race and things like that, that it typically is stuff that includes like people of color, but white people are a race too. Just, and that doesn't often get talked about. That when we talk about race, it typically involves, people of color, but, we're all a race, and that conversation has to be broader than just including, black and brown people. So with that, let me introduce the panelists here. I'll introduce them, and then I will give them their 5 minutes to do the presentation. So to my extreme left here is Marco Williams. He's a filmmaker and professor, and I know him, and probably most people do, from the film Banished. It was 2007, right? Okay. Next to him is Michelle Stevenson, who is a filmmaker and of Haitian descent. She told me that this morning, which I knew, but I'll just throw and professor too. I was getting to that, but I had to throw out the Haitian, give the Haitian descent back a shout out. The professor. And then Wesley Lowry is a friend of mine who I've known for some years. He is a national correspondent at the Washington Post, two-time Pulitzer Prize winner, and working on the third, right?
We'll see.
Okay, all right. And also he has been instrumental in helping to launch the Ida B. Wells Society that I co-founded, that Diana mentioned beginning, in terms of getting people of color, journalists of color, into the field of investigative journalism, because we're not just concerned about people being in the newsroom, we're concerned about what they do once they're in the newsroom. So with that, let me let Marco tell you a little bit more about himself, and then he has a brief presentation.
Good morning, everyone. I am Marco Williams, and I am a filmmaker, film educator, already stated. What I'd like to posit to us today, and really it amplifies a little bit of the first things that Ron said, and that is that I think that a focus on race, specifically as it pertains to African Americans, is and has always been about black bodies. And so we can certainly think about that from a sociological standpoint, scientific, how that has been manifest in our country, throughout the world. And I think as a filmmaker, I have been concerned and conscious of the types of narratives that are told that represent, construct or reconstruct the idea of how we see black bodies. And the body of my work has has really engaged a conversation about race across race, principally the binary between black and white Americans. But today what I'd like to share is a sample from a film that's in progress. It's just beginning editing. It's called Murders That Matter. It concerns itself with murders that take place within the African American community, often perpetrated at the hands of other African Americans. But what it really is about is a question that has a universal opportunity, and that is how do we handle, what do we do in the face of loss? What do we do in the face of the loss of a loved one through murder? And I follow a African-American Muslim woman in Philadelphia whose youngest son was murdered in 2011. And she engages in a series of transformative experiences, vengeance, forgiveness, activism, politics, bureaucracy. So I'm just going to show you this short clip. It's not been color corrected for the filmmakers in the room. The sound is all over the place, but it's mostly just to kind of give an example of a response to and a thinking about what do we do in the face of, in this regard, the loss of black bodies. Murders That Matter, please. Thank you.
I don't be wanting to go out the same way I come in. I really don't. I know it takes time. Everybody agree different. I know that. I'm aware of that. But I don't want to deal with it. My grandson called me. He said, "Grandma, somebody just got killed on my block. Come get me," and my mind water off. Then when I get there, he all dirty and everything. It's like all of this stuff.
The biggest known rule in this group is that we do not relive our children's homicides in this room, right? We don't relive when we got the news, or when we went to the morgue, or when we went to the food. We don't relive that stuff intentionally because that will keep us from healing. Now, will we ever be fully healed? Absolutely not. We have a saying in Islam that God only tests those that he loves the most, right? I'm being constantly tested. No, every single day. So that's why I tell people you can't move away from it. It's everywhere. It's literally everywhere in this country. And my experience is you can't run from it. I was trying to get my 2 black sons out of the city so that they wouldn't become statistics on the streets. So yes, I was trying to save my black son from the gun violence. And it didn't matter where I moved to, I wasn't able to save him. Something has to change. That's why I made my decision to run for the 190th district. I'm running for state representative of the 190th district because somebody has to lead the charge to change the situation. I don't want another mother to have to live with what I live with every day. Because when this happens to you, you can't change the pain that you have to live with every day. I give anything to have my son back. I'd rather have my son back. But God has a different path for me. So you know what? I left the city to protect my sons, and that didn't work. I'm coming back to protect yours.
Oh. Wow. Thank you, Mark. Michelle?
Okay. I guess I'd like to start for me, from a very personal perspective. I think I fall more into the category of the creative storytelling that was being talked about in the opening this morning. But it's the body of work that I do, and what pushes me comes from really the very personal experience I've had just growing up, and making sense, but also paying homage to resistance and resilience, and the idea of pushing the envelope. As someone from the Caribbean, I was born in Haiti to a Haitian father, Panamanian mother. We migrated here. I was one of that 1.5 generation. Have no real memory of the island of Haiti or of Panama, but grew up with these narratives of certainly a counter narrative to what was being told about the country where I was born. Narratives of resistance and what Haitian liberation looked like. And that kind of fueled me in the face of, as Black Latinx migrants here, facing discrimination here, but also looking at how we internalize our own oppression around colorism and other things that are really across the hemisphere. We're talking about global white supremacy, but also how it affects us in our personal behaviors. So through the work that I've done, one of the more well-known pieces is American Promise, which is a 13-year longitudinal documentary that we turned the camera on ourselves, on our son, and his journey through the private educational system in New York City. What I realized from that also is we are our audience, and that's where I put front and center the idea of not just validation, seeing ourselves in the specific comes what some people will call the universal, but the idea that thinking about me as the audience and audiences that connect to the same ideas as we construct our stories. I'm going to show two clips. The first clip is a film that from a short that was just on POV PBS called The Changing Same. And it's really about the current day legacy of a spectacle lynching that took place in Marianna, Florida. And we did this initially in collaboration with the Equal Justice Initiative. My life partner and creative partner is Joe Brewster, who's African American. And we did this story, and I'm going to just show you the clip now. And it really centers around coming to terms with the legacy that's being hidden and in denial. And you can show The Changing Same.
I asked my daddy, where did this thing happen? And he told me the road. And I said, okay, we're gonna start there. And he said, you know, that's like a long way. And I'm like, yeah, it was 14 miles. I'm gonna do it. People started messaging me, are you crazy? You're gonna get hurt. Everything changes, but nothing changes. The years pass, people live and die. But these ideas about who's on the top and who's beneath and who should stay in their place, those things don't change.
So this particular story is the story of this young man, Lamar Wilson, who's also a poet, but decides to run a marathon to commemorate the legacy of that spectacle lynching and the obstacles he confronts both in his community and outside the community and the white community from that, in that town. So fast forward to another piece that I'm working on, which brings me back home to the island of Hispaniola. I spent about 4 years working on the issue around the denationalization of Dominicans of Haitian descent, and really looking at the exploration of how white supremacy really and anti-blackness manifest themselves on that island. We've just locked picture And for me, I think it's important for us to have sort of a global lens also, given that the interconnections that happen on many levels, and us being able to look in solidarity in terms of not just the experiences, but what kind of resistance is going on outside of our boundary, our borders as well. So the initial title was Hispaniola. We just locked picture and changed it to stateless. And so I'll just show you a short clip of that, this teaser that was done a few months ago.
On the 23rd of September 2013, the Constitutional Tribunal of the Dominican Republic published its judgment, which gave consideration to the legal status of immigrants to the Dominican Republic and their offspring since 1929.
This ruling impacts descendants of immigrants of Haitian descent and who came to the Dominican Republic to work primarily in the sugarcane fields.
And now, in one fell retroactive swoop, condemned to the indignity of statelessness. Children born in the Dominican Republic with Asian grandparents are facing the possibility of mass deportation.
275,000 personas.
Con bombas lacrimógenas, disparos, agentes policiales dispersaron cientos de haitianos.
Este país se hizo sobre las manos de los dominicanos.
¿Cómo puede considerarse que la República Dominicana es un país racista si más del 80% de nuestra población está constituida por negros simulados?
Abusadores. La Constitución nuestra dice que el que nace aquí es de aquí.
The impact of this ruling could be catastrophic.
Wes?
So I'll be brief so we can get into the discussion. So I'm Wesley Lowry. I'm a national correspondent at the Washington Post, where very often my coverage involves issues of race. Among some of the major projects I've worked on was a project that is still ongoing to track fatal police shootings in the United States of America that we began in 2015. We did a big project last year that looked at unsolved homicides in major American cities and what it is like to live in neighborhoods where homicide is functionally legal. We looked at what we called murder impunity, places where murders are common but arrests are so rare that it's functionally legal to murder someone. What does that do and how does that break down a justice system? And for this last year, I've been kind of doing some one-off storytelling, kind of stories here and there, kind of as I ramp up for the next big thing. One thing that occurred to me watching both these clips, or all the clips, and thinking about the work that my colleagues up on the stage have done, is that one thing I try to think about very often when covering issues of race and how it interacts, how that thematically interacts with the world that we live in, is trying to make sure that the storytelling I'm doing captures story that's in motion, and rather than just kind of focuses on spectacle. And one of the things that's jumped off of the screen in all of the clips we just watched was that all of these are stories that have narrative arc, right? It's about how, I think very often about, New York Times won a Pulitzer in 2000 for a project called How Race is Lived in America. And I think about that the title of that project all the time, right? That race is something that is lived. It's not like a thematic topic. It's not and so very often in trying to capture and think about stories, what I select to work on, what I pitch as a project, what I pitch as a one-off, how is this something that is playing out in people's lives in a way that feels new, in a way that feels urgent, in a way that feels like it tells us something about the moment in which we're living. And so that's just something that, like I said, kind of jumped off the screen as I watched those clips because it's clearly present. And that ties into just something I think about all the time, often, that makes both this type of coverage difficult at media outlets and in mass media in general, and makes any type of coverage difficult, is that I think sometimes we have to remember that the stories we tell and our coverage of anything is based on a series of subjective decisions, right? What questions we ask matter. Right, that presented with the same character, the same subject, the same topic, the same access, many different storytellers will end up with different stories depending on what questions they ask. And I think that, and so I think the smartest coverage, or the coverage that I am most drawn to as a consumer, as a reader, as a viewer, as a listener, is the coverage that finds the way to ask the smartest questions, not only in the interaction with the subject, but very often from the very beginning, that the project itself is premised on the smartest question. And so I just think that's something that's very important to think about around issues like this. People have been doing coverage or projects and documentaries on race forever. And so every time we're entering anytime I'm trying to enter a space like that, I know I'm not the first person to do a project on policing or police shootings or a project on homicides. And so it's how do we make sure that we're asking questions or asking a question that is different and answering it in a way that's different. And that hopefully is what helps the work stand out.
Well, thank you. A hand again for the panel. So let me toss out this question and we have a conversation around it, because as I look at the clips here and listen to Wesley talk, and then also thinking about back again to the idea of the 1619 project, where the discussion is around this is a reinterpretation of history or a reinterpretation of this, but is it really that, or is it just the truth and a more holistic presentation of both this country and how we live as citizens of this country? But it also gets to that whole concept of universality, right? Which is that these are all things that everybody can identify with, except that in a lot of the cases, what we've seen in presentation of film and books and things like that has not been from our perspective, right? So the grieving mother and dealing with that, we've seen that. We just don't see that from them. Or when we think about race, we think of between whites and blacks or whites and everybody else, but not Haitians or Dominicans, right? Like that's like you're all black, so you're also. So can we like just start getting at that point, and whoever wants to like jump in first on it, Wes?
Well,
Michelle.
I'm happy. I mean, to further underscore the point I think I was previously making, right? It's part of the, even the framing of the question you're asking, right? Is this a new lens on a history? Is it just telling the truth? Is it reinterpreting? Is it, again, I think it's looking at a set of facts, looking at a shared history, and asking different questions about them that have been asked previously, right? This is one of the reasons why having a diverse and different set of storytellers is important, because again, we've got 4 storytellers on the stage who are all demographically similar. Yet each of us, when confronted with the exact same story, the exact same subject, would ask questions differently based on our own personal experiences, our own backgrounds, our own specific slivers of expertise, our own resources or challenges in the moment, right? And so what we see broadly, though, is that when we look at whether it be something as big as slavery, when we look at something like policing or police shootings or riots or uprisings, depending on what nomenclature you want to use, right? One of the differences in this moment is that you have a different set of people who are getting to ask the questions and to produce the coverage of it. And so because of that, it's providing a different lens. You know, again, I think that one thing that is hard for us to grapple with sometimes in the media writ large is that it is certainly true that there is objective truth, right? But what we also know is that we all live and experience our worlds very differently. And I think that sometimes we make the mistake of believing that there is a store brand reality, that everyone is encountering the world in the same way, when in reality we're all encountering the world very differently. And again, those differences in how we've encountered the world, in the context we bring or we understand, changes how we ask questions and how we do our job. So the example I think of very often is if you are dispatched to a small suburb of St. Louis called Ferguson, Missouri, because a bunch of people are in the streets upset about a police shooting, your own life might impact the way you ask the questions and how and where you apply pressure. If you are someone who has never been pulled over for no reason, who goes out drinking with your cop buddies every week, who the police are someone you call when you're in need, then you might have some real skepticism of all these people who are saying that the cops are just mean to them all the time and pull them over for no reason, and like that might, and so your skepticism, your questioning might be more focused on all these people making these outrageous claims. Well, if you're someone who has been pulled over for no reason, someone who has had loved ones interact with the criminal justice system, is someone who you might immediately see a validity in what the demonstrators are saying, and you might train your journalistic pressure and questions back on the police. Again, two objective reporters coming into the same story who, because of their own experience, might ask the questions differently.
Yeah, I'm going to take it a little bit more further because I see myself as the work I do as warrior. This is warrior work because we're in a battle of narratives right now. It's the myth that is keeping oppression alive today. There were, intentional things, unconscious or conscious, a whole that established a structure in which those two perspectives, one is validated over the other because the other one's given space because they want to perpetuate that status quo, right? So the question is, what is my function then? It's not just I'm asking the different questions, I'm challenging the current way of seeing things, and there's a whole community behind me doing that, and we're not sure yet which narrative is going to win, but we're going in that, we're putting the pressure. So I see it more as this systemic oppression that exists that's been allowed to perpetuate itself. What is my role in there as a maker of culture, and where can I put these pressure points in? Understanding that the people from my community not only are hurting, but have stories of resistance that need to be brought up into a platform that, for me, gives me fuel to keep going.
Very smart people, I don't know. I mean, I could bridge or amplify, and so I don't really, I'm sort of absorbing, so I don't really have anything additive to say. I do think that, I'll posit it this way, putting it out there, that I think these are what is being stated, your question, Wesley's reflection and set of questions is what we're all really contending with. And so I was just thinking about that in the last, I'm a professor, as has been noted. I teach a documentary class at Northwestern University to grad students. And the last three classes, I've been engaging the students in three different interrelated topics or questions. Ethics, whose story and who gets to tell it, and a kind of critical ethnography, our positionality to the subject matter, the recognition that even as a storyteller of color, my relationship to the communities that I enter, I still might have a certain position of power and privilege. And so this, echoes both Michelle and Wesley that, yes, I may ask certain questions, and hopefully the right questions or the best questions, certainly my questions from where I come from. But I'm hoping that in some ways I'm advancing and that's why I use the term constructing or reconstructing the narrative. So I haven't expressed myself as a warrior per se, but understanding that that's what I'm agitating for. But I do see this as all of our question or all of our thinking. What are the ethics of what we do? Who gets to tell whose story? And that's certainly where we are today. A demand that those of us who've not had our stories told by ourselves get a chance to tell our stories. And that crosses race, of course, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, religion. But also, at the end of the day, as storytellers, as reporters, understanding our positionality. What is our relationship to the stories we tell?
Let me just follow up on that sort of here in terms of who gets to tell the story and how the story is told. But to Wesley's and Michelle's point too about what you bring to the table, right? I'm a black dude from rural Mississippi, right? I mean, I grew up in a town of 500 people, 250 of them my relatives, and then we're married to the other two. But so I bring a certain thing to that, but can you talk about like what I mean, you hit on it before, like if you've never been stopped by, cops, then you have a different perspective. But just even deeper than that, as people of color, we all have different backgrounds, right? So you can't just send a person of color just to a community and say, go cover that or go do a film about it. Can you guys talk about that? Like how do we get more of a sense of bringing to the larger discussion that this is not like a one-size-fits-all, right? You just can't take a person of color and say, okay, this person of color is going to tell the story of this community. Because we bring different things.
So just from the perspective of if you will, an independent filmmaker that may be very different from a journalist, we self-select the stories that we tell, or we self-select, and there's no doubt that our self-selection is a reflection of our experience, our bias, our concerns, our passions. Periodically, we are asked or invited to do a film, and I'll give an example for myself. I was part of a series some years ago called 10 Days That Unexpectedly Changed America. And I was the only non-white filmmaker of the 10 filmmakers, and I was assigned the civil rights movement, as the storyteller. Now, I had profound resentment of this, thinking, well, why is the black guy got to do the civil rights story? There was a piece about Elvis Presley. Let the black guy really tell the truth about Elvis Presley. And yet, at the end of the day, I was grateful that I was assigned that, because then I got to tell the story from my perspective as who I was and what mattered to me. So I would be curious for you, Wesley, that like if you're assigned a story to tell, like if you have to report on something versus doing something that may be more investigative, how do you position yourself in terms of your recognition of your own bias, your own experience?
Well, and I think that there's a similar experience with that, right? It's one thing I grapple with or think about a lot is the double-edged sword of being like the black guy in the room, right? Where they're like, well, we should probably ask Wes about this, right? And you're like, oh yeah, I bet you should ask me about it. And then I'm also like, but also please ask me, don't just do this on your own. Please, where you're all like roll your eyes about your involvement, but you're also like, wait, you all did what? You called who? Like, no. Like, and so there is like a balancing act of that, right? Anyone who has ever been a minority of any sort in any space creatively understands that, right? You become the one Muslim in the room, and so every time there's anything adjacent to, we had drinks last night with a colleague who is Russian, and we were talking, we were having a very similar conversation, and she was like, yeah, like this entire Trump-Russia stuff, like the number of people who've run up to me around the room to ask me some weird question about some Russian thing, and I'm like, I don't know anything about Russia, really. My name is just long. Like, I don't, like I've been there twice with my mom, right? Like, I don't, like, but again, at the same time, you'd always rather have the colleague come up to you than not, even if that at times, takes a toll and is something that, you're asked to do a labor that maybe some of your other colleagues are not. In terms of the actual question you asked, though, Mark, which I think is smart, is I do think about that. I think very often, so much of any storytelling is knowing what your biases are coming into that story, so that you can either lean into them and challenge them. Coming in and knowing who you think the hero of the story is and the villain, so that you can so you can pressure cook those theses and make sure that that's actually true and find the nuances and complexities within that. And I think that so across issues of race, a lot of that is like being willing to figure out and to know what you don't know. I mean, I think about this, it's not even about, it's about any community, right? Memphis is different than Dallas, which is different than St. Louis, which is different than Cleveland, which is different than New York. And so dropping into, so sure, just because I may show up for the exact same event, police shooting or protest, that doesn't, the history is going to look different. The culture of the place is going to look different. The actual physical geography is going to look different. And I think that the mistake we make sometimes in mass media and journalistic media is we flatten all of these things, right? Like we portray it as if like every black ghetto is the same black ghetto, and the reality is each of these places is unique with its own unique history, with its unique culture, its own cadence, and I think that like being and its own local politics, and so being reflective of that is important in the coverage, but the only way to do that is to start by saying, I know nothing about this. How do I talk to as many people and figure out what's true? And not coming in with, well, I'm the expert, I know how this works, and let me get a few quotes and fill them in. And so I try to do that a lot when I jump into a story or into a place that I don't have a lot of experience.
But just to add to that in terms of not only going in, assuming not knowing anything, but understanding the baggage that I bring there across class, race, gender, color, identity, gender identity is key because I will be perceived differently depending on the community. I may think I have a connection, but the perception of what I bring out is not, so I may have to work that much harder to create a connection. And I think that it's really key to understand our positions of privilege. And in the case of the Stateless film, I try to integrate that in the everyday practice that I do, even with my colleagues and the teams that we build, in terms of just questioning our own baggage and how we interact with each other in the process, because process is also about change. You change things in process too, and experiment and put into practice. And I felt that I needed to challenge my position of privilege in this story, and did work with the right-wing nationalist movement in the Dominican Republic. Connecting with them based on how they perceived me, and me having to sort of not express my full self to them to get certain information and connection. It proved very difficult, but I felt that it was a way also of understanding my baggage and being able to be strategic about it and bring something else out into the story that could hopefully add more layers to what people were going to see.
Could I just follow with you, just ask about this whole idea, again, of race, and when we talk about it's typically, whites and people of color, but with the dynamic that you have in Stateless is that you have two segments on the same island, basically, two different nations, but the race, the dynamics of colorism that works here, and that's something that we talk about, but we don't deal with it as much as we do these other dynamics. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
Well, I see those as the internalized manifestation of white supremacy, where we create these barriers. For me, that island essentially is the first place where Europeans arrived in America, is the first place where Africans arrived in America, is the first church, it's the first genocide. that took place against Native people is on that island. So, and then from there, everything spread. And so you have on the one end of the island, Haiti that has just joined the African Union and kind of with its own, issues of racial caste system, but really anchored in this idea of African heritage and liberation. And on the other side of the island, the other continuum is this internalized notion that to become modern, we have to be against whatever is black, to the point of not seeing oneself reflected in the mirror, but seeing some created myth and being able to execute on that level of denial. It's kind of surreal, especially coming from a different space of how your notions of race have been shaped. But the DR is not alone in that, and that is one manifestation across Latin America that we don't talk about enough. The way white supremacy manifests itself there is all about internalization of that, and it's the opposite of the one drop. Like the one drop is like a little drop of white, then you're one step ahead of others. Right. And so, but it's the other side of that. Yeah.
Follow up on the points that Marco made too, and Wesley's talked about is when you were assigned to be like the guy to handle like the civil rights, or you're the black dude in the room, or the Asian person in the room, or the Latinx person in the room. A couple of years ago, I was trolled by this dude who also trolled you. We're not going to mention his name because then that would give him, some. But he called me up and just asked me once, it's like, well, you cover like terrorism and drug cartels and all of this stuff. Like, what has that got to do with like black stuff, right? Like, why are you covering this stuff that's not like black stuff? Right? And so my first thing is like, okay, I don't understand what black stuff is. But secondly, I can cover what I want, right? That's the whole point here, is that we're not limited to do anything, and by covering what like my colleague Nicole covers, that's not limiting, or what I do is not limiting. It's just we get to cover what we want, right? And could you just sort of talk about that? In that, I think, because that was a criticism of Spike Lee a few years ago. It's like, why do you just make black movies? Or like the question that Maya Angelou was asked, like, well, Toni Morrison was asked, like, when you're going to write about white characters. But just talk about the work and how you're able to do what you want. And it's not that, you're doing black stuff or Asian stuff or Latino stuff.
Well, again, I do think that the question of whose story and who gets to tell it does not demand that you cannot tell a story that is not your quote own, not your tribe, if you will. Wes has said, understanding your bias, leaning into it, leaning against it, questions you might ask. I do, the film that I'm just finished, or that's out on the festival circuit, is called Crafting an Echo. It's about a Greek choreographer, white European, who is asked to commission a dance for the Martha Graham Dance Company. Yeah, there's a black dancer or two in it, but it's about creativity, it's about process, it's about art. Is there an undercurrent of race? There is, but that's not what the film is about. So it's to that point, I certainly have a right to tell any kind of story that I want. And I think this is, again, using Wes has appreciated this very clearly. We don't want to only be singled out to do one thing as though that's the only thing, only clothes that we fit in. We are equally concerned that if you are going to try to wear those clothes, that you at least wear them well, you clean up well in them, but ultimately we want to make sure that why aren't you telling your stories, if you will, to some extent. So I'm careful here, and again, as an educator, I'm not telling my students that they have to do A versus B, but I'm certainly asking them to think about their relationship to that and why they have sought to tell a particular story and it's really, isn't it? It's the what do we call it? The pornography of the stories of people who are less than, and there's always the desire to kind of exploit that in some way, and that's the thing that I think needs to be challenged. And back to Michelle's point of actually confronted and resisted.
I think I had anything to add to that. No, well, I mean, I think that, so I guess I'll bring back the whole Toni Morrison kind of that you brought up, and because this idea, but she also kind of unapologetically said, I'm doing Black stories, and actually I'm trying to get the white man off my shoulder in terms of how I tell that story. And I think that there's a lot of work to be done there also, so.
Yeah, well, and I would just add to that, again, kind of building off of the Toni Morrison quote and her discussion of the writing she did. And I mean, she talks about how she was writing about the world she knew and the world she lived in. And that she was trying to capture a world that she didn't see reflected in what we referred to as the great American classics. And but all right, but there are no Black women in these. This isn't what my town looked like or my America looked like. I think that one thing for any story or any storyteller to think about and to challenge ourselves with is, who is my audience? Who am I telling this story for? Mm-hmm. Right? Because that starts to inform a lot of different questions. A piece that I'm doing for the Washington Post might look very different than the exact same piece, were I doing it for for a primarily Black audience, right? Were I doing it in? And so a lot of the questions are, again, like, who is consuming this? Like, who is this for? Both in terms of literally who's buying it, who am I producing it for, but also who is the reader I care about, right? For me as a writer, who am I, when I'm sitting and writing, who am I envisioning reading this story? Because do I want, and who is it that I want to understand what this is?
It just made me think that, so for the documentarians in the room, that there's this core application and often there is a paragraph that asks, who is your audience? And I would bet that none of us ever say, it's for the Black audience. Outstanding, because all I can think of is how often that question is posited, asked of you, and the expected answer is that this is for, so I always say, this is for this community, but of course it's also for the other community, as though it's so I just wonder about this idea that that we shouldn't have to apologize for, so there for people of African descent on the stage, and so in some sense there's a representation of that, but I keep sort of looking out in the audience, which is almost not of African descent out there, and that, so then that way the things that we're saying apply to you as well. It's, as Ron said, that white is a race and a color that has to have a focus, as well as that let's not be apologetic of who.
Yeah, I just want to add something to that, and in the key positions, I'm not sure in terms of the journalistic side of it, but for us in terms of those who read, the gatekeepers are the funders, right? The gatekeepers are those people who are in the positions of power, say, yes, we'll do this story, no, we won't do this story. And I can say the reason why I'm here is because of the people of color who were in those positions of power, who, when I did say it's for a Black audience, says, I see you, I know that it is important and it's there. I take the example of our longitudinal film, American Promise. I won't name the funder, but at that time, when this was back in like 2000, the head of that foundation basically said, we don't do stories about Black middle class. We do stories about marginalized, Black communities, and this is not going to be part of our portfolio. But it was thanks to a program officer, Black, who knew who had the similar experiences, who knew that there was an audience out there, who advocated for it, and the film got the support. So it's this idea of, we can say that as long as we know that we are represented also in those positions of those gatekeeping powers.
We are ready to open it up for questions. You said what? 4 minutes? Okay, well, I'm sure we could open it 4 minutes. Just to that point, I think you mentioned it's for filmmakers. For us as journalists, I mean, that's one of the reasons that I'm in the position that I am now, is because I get to make decisions about what gets covered and what doesn't. And there are, certainly the numbers of people of color in those positions aren't what they need to be. So I think that there is a lot of work to do there, which is, again, why we have started the society that Diana mentioned in the beginning. With that, I think we should just open it up for questions. Do we have microphones out there, or do I need to hand people a mic? We have, okay. There's a question over here.
What if the gatekeeping organization itself is detrimental to our tribe, our community? I mean, I'm just gonna bring up the Ford Foundation right now. I like Darren Walker, but I don't like prisons, right? I'm not gonna support de Blasio's plan to, erect all of these prisons all over New York City. So this is something I'm encountering just morally. Yeah. And we're just so thirsty for the big dollars, and then it's like, well, who does this organization, this gatekeeping organization, really represent? Yeah. And when you say, oh, we only include movies about poor Black folks in our portfolio, well, what is that projection? What is that organization projecting?
This is a really very personal kind of decisions that we make in our life, I think, in terms of deciding how am I going to interact with the matrix, right? What is my role going to be, right? Can I make a difference when I'm in the belly of the beast? Can I not? If not, I need a break. I need to get out of this because it's too much pressure, right? So I have to say that we all have our individual paths, and I think we have to listen to what we're feeling and saying, I can go this far, understanding that the structure is a beast. I guess that's all I can say. I've picked a certain path of trying to be as independent as I can in the stories that I try to tell, knowing that I've got communities that recognize and support the work that's being done, but also I'm not dependent. My paycheck is not, my lights are not dependent on those structures, right? My lights are dependent on other structures. But, so it's all about that, and it's a journey. It's really a journey, and I think it's a journey of us being self-aware, and, it's that green pill, red, blue pill. I always go back to that matrix, but it's that pill, right? Are we going to go through life seeing it, and then I think if we see it and then make strategic, conscious decisions, it's just a little easier for us. And so I guess that's my answer. I don't know if that's helpful, but yeah.
I don't know the answer, Adele. I don't know what one does really. And I do think that there is strong agitation currently to, at least again in the documentary film world in terms of funders, a strong agitation for a changing of the guard of who are the gatekeepers themselves, so that the gatekeepers reflect us more so. Now, the Ford Foundation is a foundation, so, although you use Kara's name, Kara is not the Ford Foundation. You could actually, then condemn, if you're concerned about that, Darren Walker, who is the head of the Ford Foundation, who's, so it's therefore it's complicated, I think, and I think Michelle is right that I guess that each one of us makes our own ethical or moral choice as to who we elect to be in bed with, and hoping that whomever is supporting our work is a partner that shares our goals and aspirations. I suspect that more often than not, those partners are not monogamous, and that they have lots of other partnerships. And if we, as you're articulating, we may not actually like the person that they're also sleeping with.
Hi. I'm working on a film that deals with white supremacy from the white perspective and essentially our role as white people to disrupt it. So this question is for Wesley. Do you think that there's a place in our current media for that type of a story? I mean, from my perspective, it seems like we need more of that. But would love for Wesley's perspective, and of course, anyone else who wants to weigh in.
Sure. I mean, yes, I do think there's a role. I certainly think there's a role for white storytellers to tell these stories and apply pressure in this space. I think that one thing that there's a lot of discussion about now, and Ron's alluded to this in some of the framing of this conversation, is that whiteness is in fact a race in and of itself, and how it functions. In the same way also that like masculinity is in fact a gender, right? And that whether we talk about it or not, it functions that way, right? And so I do think it is important to have people from within the communities being written about challenging the ideologies and the spaces of those communities. And so I certainly think that there's space for that. I think it's important. I think that grappling is important around issues of race specifically. I mean, one of the things we know to be true broadly is very often the work of having to think about and interrogate these structures falls to the people who always have to think about and interrogate this, and everyone else kind of gets to write about Elvis, right? And so I do think it's important to have white storytellers doing this work, doing these interrogations, applying this pressure. But also I think it's important and this is not just true in this specific setup, right? This is true of any storyteller in any space, right? Knowing what you don't know, not being Columbus and pretending you're discovering continents that always exist. Guess what, guys? I've solved white supremacy. I understand how it works, right? Believe it or not, people have written books about this previously for hundreds of years. And so again, and I say all that kind of facetiously, but that is also like just remembering anytime we're entering a space of sensitivity, of history, of context, having the respect for the subject to bring that along with it and knowing what we don't know. I start most of my interviews with any time I'm talking to an academic or a professor or a historian or a street historian, the lady who's lived on this corner for 400 years and knows everything that's ever happened here in this community. Well, tell me the story from the beginning. Walk me through it. What's everything I need to know? And at the end of almost any conversation, I say, okay, so what are the things I was too stupid to ask you about, right? What do I really need to know about this? And I think that humility in the questioning and in the storytelling is really important.
I would say more than important, it is fundamental for our future. We need more of this interrogation. As, again, going back to Toni Morrison and this idea of white pathology, how it manifests itself, that white supremacy has a negative impact on everyone. And we haven't even gotten there to understanding that. And that is what, we just look at our elections, we look at how, it's not us. At least I feel the answer. The answer is in that willingness to go into that uncomfortable place and asking those questions about the behavior. And how are we going to change that? That answer lies in more of that interrogation.
My concern is that there's not a receptivity to white people interrogating whiteness at the moment. It so fundamentally challenges power that those in power don't really want to engage it. And I'm going to, throw this more broadly, that I'm going to say that not everybody in the room may be a journalist or a filmmaker, but maybe you also have a day job, and white supremacy manifests itself in your workplace. And how does it get altered and changed there? And as a professor, I have gone for the radical when we do searches. I say, if you want to really have diversity, inclusion, et cetera, have the search committee be all women. See what you get. All the men, oh, no, he couldn't do that. You want to have more black people, have the search committee be all black. Oh, no. So how do we ultimately interrogate white supremacy is not just in film or in the newsroom. It's in the institutions that we are navigating on a daily basis.
If I could just add to that, just a quick story. Had a friend who adopted a child of color, and she said she went home and one of her relatives asked, couldn't you find a white one? And it reminded me, as you were saying, is there a role for films like the one that you're participating in? And I think it's not only a role, it's essential because, folks like us can't get to that. They're not going to talk to me, or, or Wes, or Michelle, or Marco. They're not going to talk to us. I mean, you're the only one that can talk to them. So, that has to be, it has to start with, beyond film. I think it has to start at the table where you're sitting and talking to people about stuff, and you hear this. And I asked what she did, and her response was like, well, he's just ignorant, and so we just ignore it. But why are you ignoring it, right? That's the problem.
I'm wondering if you can think of an example from your work, either in the field or even after your pieces have been released, where a community or an individual you were covering kind of checked one of your biases and how you responded to that.
I don't have any biases, so I'm good.
Well, mine is checked all the time. So it's like, I work, my partner is also is a filmmaking partner, and a psychiatrist, so it's like, he doesn't let me get away with anything in the process. So the questioning, and the thing about, the thing about this process also is, to get to the next level, we have to acknowledge our defensiveness, and then get rid of the defensive and say, okay, it's not about me. It's about making the situation, making the process better and more equitable, right? My students check me all the time also. But it's a growing thing. You have to take it as a space for growth.
Well, and I think that, for me, I think sometimes, I think we can think about biases in the wrong way. My bias is that I hate white people, and so I need to make sure that I'm nice to the white people I interview. Well, that's not the issue, right? Very often our bias is like the narrative bias. Like, this is what the story is, right? And I think that becomes the space sometimes where diligent and delicate work checks you and catches you. The number of times where I'm convinced I know what a story is on day 1, and then by day 7, I'm like, yeah, I was an idiot. That's not the story. It's a totally different thing, right? And giving ourselves the time and the space to work through that, going back with a diligence and saying, well, re-describe that to me again. Because what I took out of what you told me was X, Y, and Z. The number of times where I've had someone tell me the same story again and I get a basic factual new understanding of what happened all the time, right? Well, no, that's not what I meant. I didn't mean to say it like that. I meant to say it's the repetition of storytelling. You tell the same story 15 times, and each time you're picking up new details that recontextualize them, right? And how often do we allow someone to tell us a story one time and we go, all right, I understand it definitively, and now we're going to use this? Well, maybe we don't, right? Maybe, and so there's some of that. I mean, so that's something I think about a lot, is making sure that I've checked my narrative biases, what I think the story is, what I think the structure of the story is, and then also, for any of us who work with colleagues and certainly editors, their own narrative biases. Go find me a story about this thing, right? And some editor somewhere has decided what they think the arc is, or what this, and very often that might not match up with the reality. And so being willing to push back or apply pressure and stand up for what the true thing is.
Marco gets the last point.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I don't necessarily want the last point. I mean, I really do.
Well, I don't want it either.
But I wanted to answer this question, so I also try to have the last point by answering the question. So it's very specifically a scene in Two Towns of Jasper is about the murder or lynching of James Byrd Jr. in Jasper, Texas, in 1998. In the film, we present a man named Trent Smith, who you see with a host of tattoos on his body. Intentionally, it is to challenge the audience's bias because the perpetrators and the men who committed the murder also have a lot of white racist tattoos. So everybody sees Trent as being exactly like them, and yet Trent does not have a Ku Klux Klan, he doesn't have Aryan Nation, he simply has white power on his shoulders. So there is an intention in the film to challenge the audience's bias to see a man with tattoos who believes in white power, therefore he's racist. But for myself, in the course of making this film, and it's a scene that never makes it into the film, there's a debate about Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday and the school not going to have the students go to school on that day. And Trent effectively says, those people don't really know very much, and he references April 4th. Yeah, April 4th is the day that King was assassinated. And so that being a day that's, of a major significance, and that's what checked my bias, that I thought I understood Trent, and he revealed that he knew as much about what might be important and relevant to American history, so this will be the point that I make, not just black history, that the day that King was assassinated is a monumental day. And it's not simply the day that he was born, although without his birth, maybe whatever we think that he achieved or didn't achieve wouldn't occur. So that's my way of answering that, and to kind of just recognize that there's so much that we don't know, and back to so many of the things that said that we need to challenge and interrogate and acknowledge what we don't know, think about the right questions to ask, and really like what Wes has said, ostensibly begin at the beginning. Tell me the story from the beginning.
Well, listen, I want to thank my fellow panelists, Michelle Stevenson, Marco Williams, and Wesley Lowry. And thank you guys for having us.
Sky, this is your mic for your remarks. Okay, sure. And they'll make it live once you go up there.
Absolutely. Hi, how are you doing? Thanks. Okay, good, very good. All excited, all ready to go. So the clips that I sent. I was thinking about it. I'm one of the co-directors of the festival. Oh, okay. My name's Sky. This is Jennifer. She's going to be on the next panel, and she just I think we have 2 clips for her, and she just wanted to identify the one that she's going to want to prioritize. Just give me 1 minute. Absolutely. Yep, absolutely right. And then we'll just look at how it's labeled, so we can make sure you can grab it right here. It's a new one. I felt sure. I thought it was long, but I don't know if it's too long. Okay. Or we can, if it is lost too long, I want to decide an endpoint and we can identify. Okay. All right.
Let's just save. Okay, so next portion. So I have all the audio clips, is that right?
Yeah, so the guard and how long are everyone else's?
What was your name again? I'm sorry? Jennifer. So these 2 are yours? Yeah. Okay. They're all about between a minute and a half and 2 minutes. This one's 3 minutes.
That's not too long. I think that's fine.
So mine is, so they're 2.5 and 3.5. So 3.5, 3 minutes, 23 seconds. That's
I don't think so at all. I think that's fine. Absolutely.
So that's the one. Okay, so maybe just delete the other ones. Yep. Yeah, great. Okay. All right, so I have yours. Ready to go. Cool. Okay, good. So just call for it. Let me know when to play it. Oh yeah, I know. Whoever decides.
That's a good point. I mean, it's a little bit organic. I mean, it's not so formal.